What happens when a single moment of recognition shatters the carefully constructed walls of an empire built on silence? For Rachel Bennett, a 26-year-old bartender barely keeping her head above water as her father's medical expenses mounted, that moment came in the form of an heirloom she'd seen 1,000 times. For Harrison Westbrook, a man whose billion-dollar real estate empire insulated him from the messiness of ordinary life, it was a crack in the foundation of everything he believed about his family's rise to power. She was simply trying to survive another exhausting shift. He was just another wealthy patron expecting impeccable service. But when she noticed the distinctive cufflinks on his wrists, antique silver eagles with emerald eyes, a buried memory ignited into a blazing question that would dismantle generations of carefully guarded lies. This isn't a story about chance encounters. This is a story about how one bartender's sharp observation unraveled a conspiracy of theft, betrayal, and a secret that one of Chicago's most powerful dynasties believed they had erased from history forever. The amber lighting of the copper bell cast a warm glow over polished mahogany and brass fixtures. Rachel Bennett moved with practiced efficiency behind the bar, her movements economical after 6 years of slinging drinks in one establishment or another. It was 8:30 on a Wednesday evening, that peculiar hour when the after-work crowd had thinned, but before the late-night regulars arrived. The restaurant occupied the ground floor of a converted warehouse in Chicago's West Loop, all exposed brick and Edison bulbs, the kind of place that attracted both neighborhood locals and the occasional suit from the financial district. Rachel wiped down the bar top, her shoulders carrying the particular ache that came from standing on concrete floors disguised by thin rubber mats. Every muscle remembered the previous night's double shift, and her mind carried the heavier burden of the conversation she'd had with her father's oncologist that morning. Stage 4. Experimental treatments. Out-of-network specialists. The numbers had blurred together into an impossible sum that her bartender's wages and tips could never hope to touch. The door opened, and Rachel felt rather than saw the shift in the room's energy. A man entered, and the casual conversations around the bar seemed to dim slightly, as if the space itself recognized the presence of someone accustomed to commanding attention without asking for it. He was perhaps in his early 40s, tall and lean, dressed in a suit that probably cost more than Rachel's monthly rent. His dark hair was touched with grey at the temples, and he carried himself with the particular confidence of someone who had never seriously questioned whether a door would open for him. He chose a seat at the far end of the bar, away from the scattered other patrons. Rachel grabbed a menu and a coaster, arranging her professional smile. "Welcome to the Copper Bell. Can I start you off with something to drink?" The man's eyes, a startling shade of grey like storm clouds, met hers with a brief, assessing glance. "Macallan 18 neat. And the menu won't be necessary. I'm only here for the drink." His voice had the measured cadence of someone used to being listened to the first time he spoke. "Coming right up," Rachel said, turning to the top shelf where the premium scotches lived in their expensive bottles. Her co-worker and friend, Natalie Rodriguez, appeared at her elbow with a tray of empty glasses. "Did you see who just sat down?" she whispered urgently. "That's Harrison Westbrook. Westbrook Properties. They own half the new developments in the city. That tower going up on Michigan Avenue? That's his. The man's worth like $2 billion. Rachel glanced back at the man as she poured the amber liquid into a crystal tumbler. He sat with perfect posture, his attention fixed on his phone, radiating an aura of controlled solitude. To me, he's just a customer who wants expensive scotch. But as she carried the drink back to him, something caught her eye that made her footsteps falter. His hands were visible on the bar top now, and on his left wrist were cufflinks that made Rachel's breath catch in her throat. They were antique silver, each fashioned in the shape of an eagle, with its wings spread in flight. Set into each eagle's eye was a small emerald that caught the amber light. But it was the craftsmanship that stopped her, the distinctive featherwork on the wings, the particular angle of the eagle's head, the tiny engraved pattern around the edge of each piece. She had seen those cufflinks before, not these exact ones, but their mirror image, tucked away in a small wooden box in her father's hospital room. Thomas Bennett's most prized possession, a gift from his own father, Edward, who had died when Rachel was 7. The cufflinks in that box were identical. The same silver eagles, the same emerald eyes, the same intricate featherwork. Her father had told her they were one of a kind, commissioned by his father from a silversmith in the 1960s as a symbol of their family's resilience. Rachel set the scotch down carefully, her hands suddenly unsteady. The words escaped before her professional filter could stop them. "Excuse me, sir. Those cufflinks, where did you get them?" Harrison Westbrook's hand stilled on his phone. He looked up at her, and for the first time, she had his full attention. It was not a comfortable feeling. His grey eyes held an intensity that suggested he was accustomed to reading people, to assessing threats and opportunities in an instant. "I beg your pardon." Rachel's heart hammered. She should walk away, mind her own business, but the image of her father's frail hands holding that wooden box, telling her the story of his father's legacy, pushed her forward. "Your cufflinks." "The silver eagles. My father has an identical pair. He said they were one of a kind, made specially for his father." The temperature at the bar seemed to drop several degrees. Harrison Westbrook slowly lowered his phone to the bar, his movements deliberate. He raised his left wrist slightly, examining the cufflinks as if seeing them for the first time. "That is impossible," he said, his voice quiet but edged with something harder than iron. "These cufflinks have been in my family since 1965. They were commissioned by my grandfather, James Westbrook, from a master silversmith in New York. The silversmith made only one set, with a signed certificate of authenticity. They are unique." The certainty in his tone was absolute, allowing no room for doubt or discussion. But Rachel had held those cufflinks in her own hands countless times, had traced the same feather patterns, had seen the same tiny maker's mark on the underside, a stylized P enclosed in a circle. "I'm not mistaken," Rachel said, her voice gaining strength from the knowledge of her own truth. "I've seen them my whole life. My grandfather, Edward Bennett, commissioned them. There's a maker's mark on the back. A P in a circle." Harrison Westbrook's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. Not surprise exactly, but a recalculation. He turned his wrist over, revealing the underside of one cufflink. There, tiny but unmistakable, was the mark Rachel had described. The P enclosed in a circle. The silence stretched between them, charged and dangerous. He began, his tone now ice-cold. "Bennett. Rachel Bennett. Miss Bennett. I don't know what game you're playing, but I suggest you reconsider it. These cufflinks are documented Westbrook family heirlooms. If your father possesses similar items, then either he has been deceived by a skilled forger, or he is in possession of stolen property. Those are the only two possibilities. The accusation, the casual, dismissive way he suggested her father was either a fool or a criminal, ignited something fierce in Rachel's chest. Her father, who had worked 3 jobs to put her through community college before she'd had to drop out to care for him. Her father, who even now, weak and in pain, apologized for being a burden. "My father is dying," Rachel said, her voice low and shaking with controlled anger. "He's not a thief and he's not gullible. His father gave him those cufflinks 50 years ago with a story about building something meaningful and having it stolen by men with more power than conscience." Harrison Westbrook stood, his impressive height suddenly seeming designed to intimidate. He reached into his jacket, withdrew a black leather wallet, and placed a $100 bill on the bar, 5 times what his drink cost. "For the scotch and your time," he said, his voice returning to that measured, controlled tone, "I would advise you to verify your father's possessions before making serious accusations." "Good evening, Miss Bennett." He turned toward the door, but Rachel found herself speaking to his back. He said they were proof that integrity matters more than power. Harrison Westbrook stopped, his hand on the brass door handle. He didn't turn around, but she could see the tension in his shoulders. "If your father's story is true," he said quietly, then you should be prepared to prove it with more than words and sentiment. My family's reputation is not something I allowed to be questioned lightly. He pushed through the door and disappeared into the Chicago evening, leaving Rachel standing behind the bar with trembling hands and the sudden, terrible knowledge that she had just set something in motion that neither of them could stop. The next morning, Rachel sat in the uncomfortable plastic chair beside her father's hospital bed, the wooden box open on her lap. Thomas Bennett was awake but drowsy from pain medication, his once strong frame now reduced to angles and shadows beneath the hospital gown. "Dad," Rachel began carefully, "tell me again about Grandpa Edward, about his work." Thomas's eyes, still sharp despite the illness ravaging his body, focused on her with sudden intensity. "Why are you asking?" "I met someone last night, someone who had cufflinks exactly like Grandpa's. He said they were his family heirlooms, commissioned by his grandfather. He said there was only one set." Thomas was quiet for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was stronger than it had been in weeks. "Close the door, Rachel." She did, her pulse quickening. When she returned to her chair, Thomas had shifted in the bed, his gaze distant, as if looking at something far beyond the sterile hospital walls. "Your grandfather," he began, "was a brilliant structural engineer. He didn't just calculate loads and stresses. He reimagined how buildings could interact with their environments. In the early 1960s, he developed a revolutionary anchoring system for high-rises. It would allow skyscrapers to withstand earthquakes and high winds in ways that existing technology couldn't match. It was years ahead of its time." Rachel held the wooden box tighter. "He was working for Westbrook Development Corporation at the time," Thomas continued, the name landing like a stone in still water. "It was a smaller firm back then, run by James Westbrook. Your grandfather trusted him. They'd worked together for 5 years. When Edward perfected his design, he shared it with James, thinking they would patent it together, that he would finally get the recognition and partnership he deserved." "What happened?" Rachel whispered, though some part of her already knew. "James Westbrook took the designs and filed the patent under his own name. When Edward confronted him, James had lawyers draw up documents showing that anything developed while Edward was employed belonged to the company, which meant it belonged to James. It was legal, technically, but it was theft in every way that mattered." Thomas reached out, his thin fingers trembling, and Rachel took his hand. "But the cufflinks weren't about the patent," he said. "Your grandfather was devastated but ready to walk away. He would find other work, start over. But then 2 men came to our house. I was 8 years old. I remember them, dark suits, cold eyes. They spoke to my father in the kitchen while my mother held me in the other room. I couldn't hear everything, but I heard enough. They knew where I went to school. They knew my mother's doctor's appointments. They knew everything about us." Rachel felt ice in her veins. "They gave him a choice," Thomas said. "Sign over any future claims to the design, sign a non-disclosure agreement, accept a settlement of $30,000, and never speak of it again. Or refuse and watch his family suffer accidents. They were very specific about what kind of accidents." "Dad." "He signed." "Of course he signed. What else could he do?" "The $30,000 was framed as payment for consultation services. Perfectly legal, perfectly documented, and perfectly obscene. That money paid for our house, my education. It was supposed to be enough to ease his conscience. But it broke something in him, Rachel. Your grandfather was never the same." Thomas's grip tightened. "But before he signed, before those men came to our door, he had one ally, one person who believed him, who tried to help him. A man who worked in James Westbrook's office, a designer named Philip Graves. Philip was disgusted by what James had done. He couldn't stop it. He had no power, but he did something symbolic." Rachel leaned forward. "Philip was the one who commissioned the cufflinks," Thomas said. "He had them made by his father, Samuel Graves, a silversmith in New York. Samuel made 2 identical sets, one for Edward, as a symbol that his work and his integrity mattered, and one that Philip kept for himself, as a promise that he would never forget what had happened. The eagles were supposed to represent vision and freedom. The emeralds represented truth. It was their secret pact, proof that they knew what really happened, even if they couldn't speak it aloud. The pieces clicked into place with sickening clarity. The man I met last night was Harrison Westbrook, James Westbrook's grandson. Thomas closed his eyes. Then he has Philip's cufflinks. Philip must have... He paused, his breathing labored. After your grandfather signed those papers, Philip quit Westbrook Development. He disappeared. Edward tried to contact him for years, but never found him. We always wondered what happened to him, whether James had threatened him too. Rachel looked down at the silver eagles in the wooden box. They were more than heirlooms. They were evidence. They were a silent testimony to a crime that had enriched one family while destroying another. I told Harrison Westbrook about these, Rachel said quietly. He called you a thief or a fool. A ghost of a bitter smile touched Thomas's lips. James Westbrook built his empire on my father's design. Every building in his portfolio uses some variation of that anchoring system. Harrison Westbrook's billions, they're built on what was stolen from your grandfather. Of course he'd call us thieves. The only way their story works is if we're the villains. Rachel stood, the wooden box clutched in her hands. Then maybe it's time someone told a different story. Across the city, in a glass and steel office tower that bore the Westbrook name in letters tall enough to be seen from Lake Michigan, Harrison Westbrook sat at his desk and stared at the cufflinks he'd removed from his wrists. He'd worn them 100 times without thinking deeply about their origin. They'd simply been his, part of the collection of family treasures that proved the Westbrook legacy of excellence. But the bartender's words had planted a seed of doubt that he couldn't ignore. A pea in a circle. She'd known about the maker's mark, and her absolute certainty about her father's identical pair suggested she wasn't running a con. Cons required rehearsal, calculation. Her shock had been genuine. He pressed the intercom button on his desk phone. "Margaret, please send in Dennis." Dennis Caldwell appeared moments later, a sharp-eyed man in his 60s who had served as the Westbrook family's chief legal counsel for over 30 years. He was also the closest thing Harrison had to a family confidant, having known him since childhood. "Dennis, I need you to look into something discreet." Very discreet. Dennis settled into the leather chair across from Harrison's desk, his expression neutral but attentive. "Last night I met a woman named Rachel Bennett. Her father is Thomas Bennett, currently hospitalized. I need you to find out everything about him and his father, Edward Bennett. Focus on the early 1960s. I want to know if Edward Bennett ever worked for this company." Dennis's expression flickered, the briefest moment of something that might have been recognition. "Edward Bennett. That name sounds familiar. Let me check the old employment records." "There's more," Harrison said, turning one of the cufflinks over in his hand. "This woman claims her father owns cufflinks identical to these, the ones my grandfather commissioned in 1965. She knew details she couldn't have known unless she'd seen them. The maker's mark, the design specifications." Dennis was quiet for a moment, his lawyer's brain clearly working through implications. If there are duplicates, it could suggest your grandfather's commission wasn't as exclusive as the family believed. Or someone had them copied, Harrison finished. But she described them as old family heirlooms from her grandfather, not recent forgeries. "I'll look into it," Dennis said, standing. "Though I should tell you, Harrison, sometimes the stories we inherit about our families are simplified versions of more complicated truths." The careful phrasing made Harrison look up sharply. "What aren't you telling me?" Dennis hesitated at the door. "Let me do the research first. I'd rather present you with facts than speculation." After Dennis left, Harrison found himself drawn to the bookshelf behind his desk, where leather-bound volumes documented the Westbrook family history. He pulled down the volume covering 1960-1970 and flipped to the section on James Westbrook's major innovations. There it was, the revolutionary anchoring system that had allowed Westbrook Properties to bid on projects other developers couldn't touch. The design that had transformed a successful regional company into a national powerhouse. The text credited James Westbrook as the visionary engineer who had developed the system. noting his unprecedented understanding of structural dynamics. But as Harrison read the dates, something nagged at him. His grandfather had been a businessman, not an engineer. He'd had a degree in finance. How had he suddenly produced engineering innovations that baffled competitors? Harrison's phone buzzed. A text from Dennis. Found something. Coming back up. When Dennis returned, he carried a slim file folder and an expression that made Harrison's stomach tighten. Edward Bennett worked for Westbrook Development from 1959 to 1964, Dennis began, sitting down. He was a senior structural engineer, considered brilliant by all accounts. He left abruptly in August 1964. No exit interview, no forwarding address filed with HR. Just gone. He opened the folder and slid a single page across the desk. This is a consulting agreement dated August 15th, 1964. Edward U. Bennett agrees to transfer all intellectual property developed during his employment to Westbrook Development in exchange for a one-time payment of $30,000. He also signs a non-disclosure agreement preventing him from discussing any proprietary designs. Harrison read the document carefully. It was professionally drafted, perfectly legal, but the date made him pause. This is dated 2 months after the patent filing for the anchoring system. Yes. If he developed it while employed here, why would my grandfather need him to sign this after the fact? Dennis was quiet for a moment. There could be many reasons. Perhaps there was ambiguity about when certain developments occurred. Perhaps your grandfather was simply being thorough, ensuring there could be no future claims. Or perhaps, Harrison said slowly, Edward Bennett developed the system on his own time, and my grandfather pressured him into signing it over after the fact. That would be speculation. Find me the name of the silversmith who made these cufflinks, Harrison ordered, holding up the eagles. I want the original commission records. Dennis nodded. There's one more thing you should know. Philip Graves. He worked as a designer for your grandfather in the mid-60s. He quit abruptly in September 1964, 1 month after Bennett left. No explanation given. I found his name on some old project files, but he seems to have disappeared from any professional records after that. No subsequent employment history, no forwarding address. The name struck something deep in Harrison's memory. Philip Graves. He'd heard that name before, whispered in family stories. My grandfather had a designer who betrayed him, Harrison said slowly, recalling the vague tale. The story was that this designer tried to steal company secrets to start a competing firm. That's the official story, Dennis said carefully. But there's no lawsuit filed, no police report, no evidence of any actual betrayal. Just an employee who left suddenly and whose name is never mentioned again in company documents. Harrison stood and walked to the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. His city, built on buildings that used the anchoring system that bore his grandfather's name. Every project, every success, every $1 billion in the Westbrook portfolio could be traced back to that innovation. If Rachel Bennett's story was true, if her grandfather had been coerced into signing away his life's work, then everything Harrison believed about his family was built on a foundation of theft. Get me the silversmith's records, Harrison said, his voice hard, and find out what happened to Philip Graves. I need to know if my grandfather was a visionary or a thief. 3 days later, Rachel received a text from an unknown number, the signature room, 7 p.m. tomorrow. We need to talk. H. Westbrook. The signature room was a restaurant on the 95th floor of the John Hancock Center, the kind of place where a single appetizer cost what Rachel made in an afternoon shift. She almost didn't go, but the thought of her father, wasting away in that hospital bed, gave her courage she didn't know she possessed. She wore the only dress she owned that seemed remotely appropriate, a simple black sheath her father had bought her for community college interviews years ago. The hostess looked at her with barely concealed skepticism until Harrison Westbrook appeared. And suddenly, Rachel was being escorted to a private table by the window where the city spread out below them like a carpet of lights. Harrison stood as she approached. He wore a dark suit, perfectly tailored, but there was something different about him. The armor of absolute certainty he'd worn at the Copper Bell had developed hairline cracks. "Miss Bennet, thank you for coming." Rachel sat down, her heart pounding. "I almost didn't. I wouldn't have blamed you." He gestured, and a waiter appeared with water glasses before disappearing silently. "I owe you an apology. What I said at your workplace was unforgivable." Rachel blinked, not expecting that. "You called my father a thief." "I know. And I was wrong." Harrison opened a leather portfolio on the table. "I've spent the last 3 days investigating something I should have questioned years ago. Samuel Graves, the silversmith in New York. I found his commission records." He slid a photograph across the table. It showed a page from an ornate ledger dated January 1965. The entry read, "Commission for Philip Graves. 2 sets of cufflinks, sterling silver, eagle design with emerald eyes. Maker's mark, SG in circle. 1 set to be delivered to P. Graves, 1 set to be delivered per his instruction to Edward Bennett, Chicago." Rachel's hands trembled as she looked at the evidence. Philip Graves had commissioned both sets, 1 for himself, 1 for her grandfather. They weren't copies. They were intentional twins. "Philip Graves worked for my grandfather," Harrison continued. "He quit 1 month after your grandfather left. According to the official story, he was a traitor who tried to steal company's secrets. But I couldn't find any evidence of that. No lawsuits, no police reports. Just a man who disappeared and whose name was never spoken again in my family." "Why would he give my grandfather cufflinks?" Rachel asked. Harrison pulled out another document, a yellowed letter, the paper brittle with age. "This was in my grandfather's private papers, kept in a safe deposit box. I only got access this morning with the bank manager's help. It's from Philip Graves, dated September 1st, 1964. Rachel read the letter, and with each line, the story became clearer and more heartbreaking. "James, I can no longer in good conscience work for a man who would threaten another's family to steal his life's work. You told me Edward Bennett's anchoring system was a collaborative effort, that he would be compensated fairly. Instead, I watched you file the patent under your name alone, and I listened through your office door when your men threatened his wife and son. I'm not brave enough to go to the authorities. You've made it clear what happens to those who cross you. But I am brave enough to quit. I've commissioned a reminder for Edward, a small symbol that someone knows the truth of what you did. I hope someday it will matter. You will build your empire on his stolen work, and you will call it success. But you and I will both know what it really is. I resign, effective immediately." Philip Graves, the letter was a confession written by a witness, damning in its clarity. Rachel looked up at Harrison, seeing her own shock reflected in his face. "My grandfather," Harrison said quietly, "was a thief. He stole your grandfather's work. He threatened your family. And when Philip Graves tried to stand up for Edward, my grandfather drove him away too." "Where's Philip now?" Rachel asked. "Dead. He died in 1998, never married, no children. His cufflinks were auctioned off with his estate. My father bought them, thinking they were just vintage pieces. He gave them to me on my 30th birthday. I've been wearing stolen goods, proof of my grandfather's crime, for years without knowing it. The weight of inherited guilt sat heavy between them." Harrison looked older suddenly, the certainty that had armored him stripped away. "What do you want from me?" Rachel asked quietly. "Why tell me all this?" "Because you deserve to know the truth. Because your family deserves recognition. And because—" He paused, his jaw tight. "Because my company, my wealth, my entire life is built on what was stolen from your grandfather. And I need to know what justice looks like." Rachel thought of her father in his hospital bed, thought of the impossible medical bills, thought of how easy it would be to name a price that would solve all her immediate problems. But she also thought of what her grandfather had told her father: integrity matters more than power. "My father said his father died broken," Rachel said. "Not because of the money he lost, but because he was forced to betray his own principles to keep his family safe. He signed those papers knowing the truth would die with him, but it didn't," Harrison said. "You're here, and Philip Graves left proof." "I want my grandfather's name on that patent," Rachel said, her voice steady and clear. I want the historical record corrected. I want every building that uses that system to acknowledge Edward Bennett as its true inventor. I don't want money. I want his name back. Harrison studied her for a long moment, and she saw something like respect flicker in his grey eyes. There's a charity gala next week, he said. The Westbrook Foundation's annual fundraiser. Every major figure in Chicago's business world will be there, along with the press. If we're going to rewrite history, that's where we do it. We, Rachel repeated. My family's crime, Harrison said. My responsibility to correct it. Together, Rachel thought about her father, about whether this vindication would matter to him now, so close to the end. But she knew it would. Some debts transcended generations. Together, she agreed. What neither Rachel nor Harrison knew was that their investigation had not gone unnoticed. That same evening, in a townhouse in Chicago's Gold Coast neighborhood, Harrison's uncle, Richard Westbrook, sat in his study reviewing the reports from the private investigator he'd hired. Richard was James Westbrook's younger son. Harrison's uncle, 58 years old, silver-haired and deeply invested in maintaining the Westbrook family's pristine reputation. He had spent his career managing the family's foundation and public image, while his older brother, Harrison's father, had run the actual business until his death 5 years earlier. Now Richard stared at the photographs of Harrison meeting with Rachel Bennett, at the copies of documents his investigator had obtained from less than ethical sources, and he felt the careful edifice of the family's legacy beginning to crack. He picked up his phone and dialed a number he hadn't used in years. It's Richard Westbrook. I need you to handle something delicate. There's a woman named Rachel Bennett making claims about my father. I need her discredited before she has a chance to speak publicly. The voice on the other end was professional, cold. What kind of discrediting? Find something. Financial impropriety, substance abuse, anything that makes her look unstable or opportunistic. She's a bartender with a dying father and medical debt. There has to be something we can use, and if there isn't, Richard's voice hardened, then create something. I don't care how. The Westbrook name is not going to be dragged through the mud by some opportunistic child looking for a payout. He hung up and poured himself 3 fingers of bourbon. Harrison was young, idealistic, still soft enough to believe that honesty was more valuable than reputation. Richard knew better. He had spent decades protecting the family image, smoothing over his father's rougher edges, ensuring that James Westbrook was remembered as a visionary rather than the ruthless businessman he'd actually been. If some engineer had been forced to sign over his designs 50 years ago, well, that was simply how business was done. The Westbrook empire had been built, and it provided for dozens of family members, funded charity work, created thousands of jobs. The individual cost to Edward Bennett, tragic perhaps, but ultimately insignificant in the face of everything the company had achieved. Richard would not let Harrison's conscience destroy what generations had built. If that meant destroying Rachel Bennett first, so be it. The week leading up to the gala was a blur of activity. Harrison's lawyers drew up documents amending the patent records, drafted press releases, and prepared legal framework for officially crediting Edward Bennett with the invention. Rachel spent her days at the hospital with her father, preparing him for what was to come. "You're sure about this?" Thomas asked weakly, his condition visibly deteriorating. "These are powerful people, Rachel. They'll fight back." "Let them," Rachel said with more courage than she felt. "Grandpa couldn't speak up." "You couldn't speak up, but I can." The night before the gala, Rachel was closing up her apartment when there was a knock at the door. She opened it to find a woman in an expensive pantsuit, flanked by 2 men in dark suits. The woman's smile was cold and professional. "Rachel Bennett? I'm Jennifer Hartley with Chicago Business Review. I was hoping to ask you a few questions about your allegations against Westbrook Properties." Rachel's instincts screamed warning, but she kept her voice steady. "I haven't made any public allegations." "Not yet," Jennifer agreed. "But I understand you plan to tomorrow night. I wanted to give you a chance to comment on some information that's come to my attention." She held up a folder. about your financial situation and some interesting discrepancies in your father's medical claims. Rachel felt ice flood her veins. What are you talking about? We've received documentation suggesting that you may have falsified information to secure your father's insurance coverage and that you've been soliciting donations under false pretenses. There are also questions about some cash deposits to your account that don't align with your declared income. Every word was a lie. Rachel knew it instantly. She'd been meticulous with her father's insurance, had never solicited any donations, and every penny she earned was declared. But she also knew that lies printed in a major business publication would be impossible to disprove before the gala, and the stain on her credibility might never fully wash away. "Get out," Rachel said, her voice shaking with rage. "Get out of my apartment right now." Jennifer's smile widened. "I'm giving you a chance to withdraw whatever claims you're planning to make. Think carefully, Miss Bennett. Your father's medical care is expensive. It would be a shame if insurance fraud charges meant he lost his coverage entirely." Rachel slammed the door in the woman's face and immediately called Harrison. He answered on the first ring. "What's wrong?" She told him about the visit, about the threats disguised as journalistic inquiry. Harrison's response was a string of profanity that would have made Rachel's father blush. "That's my uncle," Harrison said grimly. "Richard. He manages the foundation, controls the public relations. He must have gotten wind of what we're planning." "They're going to destroy me," Rachel said, hating how her voice trembled. "Even if I prove the allegations are false, the suspicion will follow me forever." "And if they go after my father's insurance, they won't," Harrison interrupted. "Rachel, listen to me. My uncle is good at manipulating public opinion, but I own the company. I have resources he can't match. First thing tomorrow, I'm having my security team and IT department pull all your financial records, your father's insurance records, everything. We're going to document that this is a manufactured hit job, and we're going to make Richard explain himself publicly." "He's your family," Rachel said. "So were the people who threatened your grandfather," Harrison replied. "Sometimes family is exactly what we need to stand up against. Get some rest. Tomorrow we tell the truth and let the chips fall where they may." The annual Westbrook Foundation Gala was held at the Chicago Cultural Center, a stunning Beaux-Arts building with a magnificent Tiffany dome. The city's elite gathered under that dome: politicians, business leaders, philanthropists, and journalists. The foundation raised millions each year for various charitable causes, and the gala was the social event of the season. Richard Westbrook stood near the entrance, resplendent in a custom tuxedo, greeting guests with practiced warmth. He spotted Harrison arriving with Rachel Bennett and felt his jaw tighten. The girl looked terrified but determined, dressed in a simple but elegant navy gown. They made their way through the crowd toward the main ballroom. Richard intercepted them smoothly. "Harrison, what a surprise. I didn't realize you were bringing a guest." "Uncle Richard," Harrison said, his tone carrying a warning. "This is Rachel Bennett. I believe you've already made her acquaintance indirectly." Richard's smile didn't waver. "I'm afraid I don't know what you mean." "The Chicago Business Review journalist who showed up at Rachel's apartment last night," Harrison said quietly, his voice pitched for Richard's ears alone. "The one threatening to publish fabricated fraud allegations. Did you really think I wouldn't trace that back to you?" Richard's mask slipped for just a moment, his eyes hardening. "I'm protecting this family. If you had any sense, you're protecting a lie," Harrison interrupted. "And in about 20 minutes, everyone in this room is going to know the truth." He guided Rachel past Richard into the ballroom, leaving his uncle standing alone with his fury. The evening proceeded with the usual rhythm of such events: cocktails, silent auction bidding, dinner service. Rachel sat at Harrison's table, flanked by his lawyers and a carefully selected group of allies. Across the room, she could see Richard working the crowd, his smile never faltering, but his eyes kept darting toward their table with barely concealed anxiety. As dessert was being served, Harrison stood and made his way to the podium. The room gradually quieted. the clink of silverware fading as attention turned toward him. "Good evening, everyone. Thank you for being here tonight and for your continued support of the Westbrook Foundation's work." His voice was steady, commanding. "Tonight, I want to talk about legacy, what we inherit, what we choose to acknowledge, and what we owe to the truth." A ripple of curiosity moved through the crowd. This wasn't the usual fundraising speech. In 1964, my grandfather James Westbrook filed a patent for a revolutionary anchoring system that transformed our company and the construction industry. That system has been credited to him for nearly 60 years. Tonight, I'm here to tell you that credit was wrongly given. The room erupted in whispers. Richard half rose from his seat, his face flushing red. Harrison continued, his voice cutting through the noise. "The anchoring system was designed by Edward Bennett, a brilliant structural engineer who worked for my grandfather. Instead of recognizing his achievement, my grandfather took the design, filed the patent under his own name, and coerced Edward Bennett into signing away his rights through threats against his family." Rachel felt every eye in the room turn toward her as Harrison gestured in her direction. "This is Rachel Bennett, Edward's granddaughter. She came to me with proof that I initially dismissed because it challenged everything I believed about my family. But the evidence is undeniable." Large screens around the ballroom flickered to life, displaying the letter from Philip Graves, the silversmith's commission records, and the consulting agreement with its suspiciously convenient timing. Philip Graves, a designer who worked for my grandfather, witnessed this theft and tried to create a record of the truth. He commissioned these cufflinks. Harrison held up his wrists, the silver eagles catching the light, as matching symbols. One set for Edward Bennett, one for himself. They were meant to be proof that someone knew what really happened. Richard was on his feet now. "Harrison, this is completely inappropriate. Sit down, Uncle Richard," Harrison said, his voice sharp as a blade. "Especially since you spent this week trying to fabricate fraud allegations against Miss Bennett to silence her before she could speak tonight." Gasps echoed through the ballroom. Journalists at the press tables were typing furiously. "I have documentation proving that you hired someone to create false evidence of financial impropriety, and that you sent a fake journalist to threaten her with exposure if she didn't withdraw her claims. That is witness intimidation, and it's exactly the kind of behavior my grandfather used to build his empire. Threats, coercion, and the systematic destruction of anyone who challenged him." Richard's face had gone from red to white. "You have no proof. I have recordings," Harrison interrupted. "Your private investigator was very thorough in his reporting. Unfortunately for you, he kept detailed records, and those records include your phone conversations instructing him to create something if he couldn't find legitimate dirt on Miss Bennett." The room was utterly silent now, hundreds of pairs of eyes fixed on the unfolding family drama. Harrison turned his attention back to the broader audience. "Effective immediately, Westbrook Properties will be amending its patent records to credit Edward Bennett as the inventor of the anchoring system. We are establishing the Edward Bennett Memorial Fund for Independent Innovation with an initial endowment of $50 million to support inventors and engineers who lack the resources to protect their intellectual property." He paused, letting the number sink in. "Additionally, every building that uses the Bennett anchoring system will receive a plaque acknowledging its true inventor. This is not charity. This is not generosity. This is a small attempt at justice, decades too late." Rachel found herself standing without quite meaning to, her legs shaky but holding. Harrison extended his hand toward her, and she walked to the podium on trembling legs. "My grandfather," she said into the microphone, her voice softer than Harrison's but carrying clearly in the silent room, "died when I was 7 years old. I never really knew him, but my father told me that what broke his heart wasn't the money or the recognition he lost. It was being forced to betray his own principles to keep his family safe. He had to sign papers saying his life's work belonged to someone else, and he had to stay silent about it for the rest of his life. She looked directly at Richard Westbrook, who was still standing, his hands gripping the back of his chair. "You tried to do the same thing to me this week. You tried to threaten me into silence. But the difference between now and 1964 is that I have someone willing to stand with me. Your nephew chose truth over family loyalty, and that took more courage than anything I've done." She turned to Harrison. "Thank you. For my grandfather, for my father, and for proving that not everyone is willing to profit from stolen work." The ballroom erupted, not in polite applause, but in a chaotic mixture of shocked conversation, frantic note-taking by journalists, and a few genuine moved people clapping. Rachel saw tears on several faces, saw others already on their phones spreading the news. Richard Westbrook stood frozen for one more moment, then turned and walked out of the ballroom, his dignified facade finally shattered. Several board members and family friends followed him, while others remained seated, processing the revelation. In the aftermath, as the gala dissolved into clusters of urgent conversation, Harrison's legal team formed a protective circle around Rachel, fielding questions from reporters and well-wishers. Harrison himself stood beside her, his presence a steady anchor. "What happens now?" Rachel asked quietly. "Now?" Harrison looked around the room at the empire his grandfather had built. "Now we rebuild, properly this time, with integrity instead of theft as our foundation." 3 months later, Rachel sat in a private room at Northwestern Memorial Hospital. Her father's condition had stabilized, not improved, not cured, but stabilized. The experimental treatments Harrison's company insurance had covered were buying time, precious weeks and months that would have been impossible before. Thomas Bennett was awake and lucid, looking at the bronze plaque Rachel had brought to show him. It read, "The Bennett Anchoring System, invented by Edward Bennett, 1963. This building stands as testament to innovation, integrity, and the eventual triumph of truth." "They're putting one on every Westbrook building," Rachel said. Harrison insisted, and the Memorial Fund has already received applications from over 500 inventors seeking support. Thomas touched the plaque gently, tears sliding down his weathered cheeks. Dad would have liked this. Not the recognition for himself. He was never about that. But the idea that other inventors would be protected, that someone would stand up for them. "Philip Graves stood up for him," Rachel said, "in the only way he could." "And Harrison Westbrook stood up for all of us," Thomas added. "That takes a rare kind of person to acknowledge your family's crimes and make them right, knowing what it will cost you." It had cost Harrison plenty. Several family members, led by Richard, had resigned from the company and the foundation. There had been a bitter legal fight over the family trust, with Richard attempting to have Harrison removed as CEO. But the board had stood by Harrison, recognizing that his honesty, however painful, was preferable to the alternative of having the deception exposed by outside forces. Richard himself was facing criminal charges for witness intimidation and fraud. His carefully curated reputation as a philanthropist had crumbled overnight. There was a knock at the door, and Harrison appeared, carrying a box of pastries from Thomas's favorite bakery. He'd taken to visiting regularly, treating Thomas not as an obligation, but as a connection to the history that had reshaped his understanding of his own family. "How are you feeling today, Thomas?" Harrison asked, setting the pastries on the bedside table. "Well enough to eat too many of those," Thomas replied with a weak smile. "Rachel showed me the plaque. It's beautiful." Harrison nodded. "We unveiled the first one yesterday at the Hancock Center. There was a ceremony. I wish you could have been there." He paused. "Actually, that's partly why I'm here. When you're feeling stronger, I'd like you to come to the company headquarters. We're renaming the main conference room after your father. I want you to be there for that." Thomas's eyes brightened with tears again. "I'd be honored." After some more conversation, Harrison and Rachel stepped out into the hallway to give Thomas time to rest. "He's getting better," Rachel observed. "Slowly, but better." "Thanks to the treatments," Harrison said. "I wish we'd known sooner. We might have—" He stopped himself. "Might have started treatment earlier," Rachel finished. "I know, but we didn't know. Now we do. And we're moving forward. That's all we can do." They walked together to the hospital cafeteria, falling into the comfortable rhythm of conversation they'd developed over the past months. Their relationship had evolved from adversarial to allied to something more complex, a friendship forged in the intersection of their families' tangled histories. "I've been thinking about Philip Graves," Harrison said, as they sat with terrible coffee neither of them would actually drink. "He saw an injustice and couldn't stop it, but he created a record of the truth. Those cufflinks were his message in a bottle, sent to a future he wouldn't live to see." "He had faith that truth would matter eventually," Rachel agreed, "even if it took 60 years. My grandfather built an empire on stolen work and intimidation," Harrison said quietly. "My uncle tried to protect that legacy through more lies. But Philip Graves and your grandfather believed that integrity mattered more than power or profit." "They were right." Rachel looked at him, this man who had voluntarily torn down the mythologies he'd been raised with, who had chosen truth at enormous personal cost. "You proved they were right. You had every reason to protect your family's reputation, to dismiss me as a con artist. But you didn't." "I almost did," Harrison admitted. "That first night at the bar, I was so certain you were wrong. It was easier to believe you were a liar than to question everything I'd been taught about my family." "What changed?" Harrison pulled out his phone and showed her a photograph, the letter from Philip Graves, the one that had laid out James Westbrook's crimes so clearly. "This, reading my grandfather's crimes in black and white, written by someone who had witnessed them, I couldn't unsee it. And once I knew the truth, I had to decide what kind of person I wanted to be. Did I want to be like my grandfather and uncle, protecting a false legacy? Or did I want to be like Philip Graves, standing up for what was right even when it cost him everything?" "It did cost him everything," Rachel said softly. "He never had a family, never worked in his field again. He died alone, but his message got through," Harrison countered. 60 years later, his cufflinks brought us together. His letter exposed the truth. He didn't die alone. His principles lived on, waiting for someone to find them and honor them. They sat in companionable silence for a moment, the weight of inherited histories settling between them. "What happens next?" Rachel asked. "After the plaques are up? After the fund is established? After we've done everything we can to set the record straight?" Harrison looked at her intently. "I was hoping you might help me answer that. The company needs to be more than a monument to a corrected wrong. It needs to actively work to support innovation, to protect the kind of brilliant minds my grandfather exploited. I want to create a division focused on supporting independent inventors, providing them with legal protection, funding, and resources. And I want you to run it." Rachel stared at him. "Me? I'm a bartender, Harrison. I don't have any business experience." "You took on a billion-dollar company to defend your family's honor," Harrison interrupted. "You faced down threats and intimidation. You uncovered a 60-year-old conspiracy. Those are exactly the qualities I need. Plus you understand what it's like to feel powerless against institutional forces. You'll fight for these inventors in ways someone who's always had power never could." Rachel's mind raced. It was terrifying and tempting in equal measure. "I need to think about it, and I need to talk to my father." "Of course, take all the time you need." Harrison stood. "But Rachel, you changed my life. You changed my company. You restored justice to a story that had been buried for decades. I think you're capable of much more than you give yourself credit for." Thomas Bennett died 6 months later, on a clear autumn morning with Rachel holding his hand. His final months had been peaceful, free from the weight of his father's silenced story. He'd lived to see Edward Bennett's name restored, to attend the ceremony renaming the conference room, to read articles celebrating his father as a brilliant innovator rather than a forgotten nobody. At the funeral, Harrison Westbrook stood in the back, paying his respects alongside several Westbrook Properties employees who had never met Thomas but had been moved by his story. The small church was also filled with engineers, inventors, and innovators, the first recipients of grants from the Edward Bennett Memorial Fund. People whose work was being protected and celebrated in ways Edward himself had never experienced. Rachel delivered the eulogy, her voice steady, even as tears streamed down her face. "My father spent his life carrying two burdens, the burden of his own father's silenced story, and the burden of knowing he couldn't speak that truth without risking everything. But in the end, the truth found its way out. It took 60 years, a chance encounter in a bar, and two people willing to question their family's mythologies. My father died knowing that his father's legacy was secure, that Edward Bennett's name would be remembered and honored. That gave him peace, and for that I'm grateful." After the service, Rachel and Harrison stood together in the cemetery as the other mourners gradually departed. "He was ready," Rachel said quietly. "He told me the night before. He said he'd been ready for years, but now he could go knowing the story was complete." "I wish I could have known your grandfather," Harrison said. "Everything I've learned about him suggests he was exactly the kind of innovative mind the industry needed. He was just a man who wanted to build things that would last," Rachel replied. "Buildings that would stand strong in storms and earthquakes, protecting the people inside. There's something beautiful in that, creating safety for others." Harrison nodded slowly. "That's what I want Westbrook Properties to be now. Not just buildings that stand, but a company that stands for something, that protects and nurtures innovation instead of stealing it." Rachel turned to face him fully. "I've made my decision. About your offer." Harrison waited, not pushing, just listening. "I'll do it," Rachel said. "I'll run your innovation division. But on one condition, it can't be Westbrook Properties division. It needs to be independent, structurally separate, so that inventors know they're not just dealing with another corporation that might exploit them. Create a separate entity, give it its own board, and I'll build it into something that would have protected my grandfather." A slow smile spread across Harrison's face. "The Bennett Innovation Trust." "Yes," Rachel agreed. "And you're not on the board. Neither is anyone from your family. It needs to be truly independent. Lawyers, engineers, ethicists, people who understand what it means to be vulnerable in the face of power." "Done," Harrison said immediately. "I'll fund it, but I won't control it." "That's exactly right." They shook hands there in the cemetery, sealing an agreement that felt like more than business. It felt like a promise to the ghosts who had brought them together, Edward Bennett, who had created something beautiful and had it stolen, Philip Graves, who had witnessed injustice and preserved the truth, and Thomas Bennett, who had carried the weight of silenced history until his daughter could finally speak it aloud. 2 years later, Rachel stood in the gleaming offices of the Bennett Innovation Trust, located not in a Westbrook building, but in a renovated factory in Chicago's West Loop, not far from where she'd worked at the Copper Bell. The bar was gone now, replaced by a coffee shop, but Rachel could still remember standing behind that counter the night Harrison Westbrook had walked in and changed both their lives. The trust had supported over 200 inventors in its first 2 years, providing legal protection, seed funding, and mentorship. 3 of their supported projects had already resulted in patents, and crucially, those patents belonged to the inventors themselves, not to any corporation. Rachel's office walls were decorated with photographs. Her grandfather Edward, young and confident, standing beside one of his early structural designs. Philip Graves' portrait, recovered from archived Westbrook files. Her father Thomas, smiling in the renamed conference room. And a new photo of Harrison at the first trust fundraiser, looking more at peace than he had the night they'd met. There was a knock at her door, and Natalie Rodriguez poked her head in. Rachel had hired her old co-worker as the Trust's community outreach coordinator. Natalie's ability to connect with people from all backgrounds made her perfect for the role. "Ready for the ceremony?" Natalie asked. Rachel nodded, picking up the small velvet box from her desk. Inside were the 2 sets of cufflinks, the silver eagles with emerald eyes, Edwards and Phillips, united at last. Today, they would be donated to the Chicago History Museum as part of a permanent exhibition on industrial innovation and corporate ethics. The ceremony was small but meaningful. Harrison was there, along with several board members from both Westbrook Properties and the Bennett Trust. The museum's curator spoke eloquently about the importance of preserving difficult histories, of acknowledging both innovation and the exploitation that sometimes accompanied it. When it was Rachel's turn to speak, she held up the cufflinks so the light caught the emeralds. "These were made as symbols of integrity and truth," she said. "They were separated for 60 years, just as my grandfather and Philip Graves were separated by forces beyond their control. But they're together now, and they tell a complete story, not just of theft and injustice, but of courage, redemption, and the long arc of truth." She placed them carefully in the display case, where they would rest alongside the patent documents, Philip Graves's letter, and Edward Bennett's original design sketches, a complete archive of a wrong committed and eventually made right. After the ceremony, as guests mingled over champagne and canapés, Harrison approached Rachel with a thoughtful expression. "I've been offered a position on the mayor's ethics commission," he said. "They want someone from the business community who's demonstrated a commitment to accountability. Are you going to take it?" Rachel asked. "I think so, but it means I'll need to step back from some of my day-to-day work at the company. I'll remain CEO, but I'm promoting several people who share our vision. The next generation, building on a corrected foundation." Rachel smiled. "Your grandfather built an empire on theft. You're building something better, an empire on truth. That's a legacy worth having." "We're building it," Harrison corrected. "This isn't my redemption story, Rachel. It's our story, yours, mine, Philip's, your grandfather's, even my grandfather's in a twisted way. All of our choices, for good or ill, led to this moment." Rachel looked around the museum gallery, at the display that would educate future generations about the complexity of progress, about how innovation could be both celebrated and stolen, about how truth could be buried but never truly destroyed. "Then let's make sure the next chapter is worth telling," she said. They raised their champagne glasses in a quiet toast, not to success or wealth or power, but to something more fundamental: integrity, honesty, and the courage to face uncomfortable truths about the legacies we inherit. The Bennett Innovation Trust thrived, becoming a model for ethical innovation support that other cities began to replicate. Rachel Bennett became a sought-after speaker on corporate ethics and intellectual property protection, though she never forgot her roots as a bartender who'd simply recognized a pair of cufflinks. Harrison Westbrook remained CEO of Westbrook Properties, but transformed it into an industry leader in ethical business practices, proving that profit and principle could coexist. He never married, never had children, but he often said that the trust was his true legacy, a living monument to the idea that it's never too late to choose integrity over convenience. Richard Westbrook served 18 months in prison for witness intimidation and fraud. Upon his release, he disappeared from public life entirely, his once sterling reputation permanently tarnished. The Edward Bennett anchoring system continued to protect thousands of buildings and millions of people, and now every structure that used it bore a plaque honoring its true inventor, a quiet engineer who'd been forced to sign away his life's work to protect his family. And in the Chicago History Museum, the silver eagles with emerald eyes rested side by side, forever united, their story complete at last. Sometimes a single moment, a glance, a recognition, a question asked, can unravel decades of carefully constructed lies. Rachel Bennett's observation about a pair of cufflinks began a journey that restored justice, rebuilt a corporate legacy, and proved that truth, no matter how deeply buried, has a power that wealth cannot suppress. Her story reminds us that speaking up in the face of power requires immense courage, and that sometimes the greatest legacy we can leave is not what we build, but what we choose to make right. If this story of truth, redemption, and the transformative power of courage resonated with you, please share it with someone who needs to be reminded that one person's voice can change everything.